Now, this morning we talked about a passage in Matthew chapter 14, and we made a very brief passing mention of it. And it is, of course, the idea that Peter saw Jesus walking on the water, requested permission to walk on the water, and did, in fact, walk on the water for a time, and then began to look at all the things surrounding him and the problems that he had, and he began to sink and was rebuked for having little faith. We're going to look at this chapter this evening, the chapter in its entirety. And this is a very unimaginative title to a lesson. I entitled the lesson, A Day in the Life of Jesus. But the reason that I chose this chapter is because it is kind of amazing when we look at this chapter, the number of things that happened. And one of the things that I really want you to notice is how that Jesus was constantly putting everyone's wishes and needs above his own. That he wasn't a person that was always thinking of what I want to do, but rather he was always thinking of what would be in the best interest of other people. Now, this was a pretty sad day in the life of Jesus Christ. I want to read the first 12 verses before we begin and kind of make comment on it. The first 12 verses, actually, you have first 2 verses talking about where Jesus was at and what he was involved in. It says, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard of the fame of Jesus and said unto his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead. Therefore, mighty works do show forth themselves in him. Now, of course, that was brought about in his mind because he had killed John the Baptist. Well, it goes back then and it reflects upon when John was killed and the reaction that Jesus had. So it actually introduces the thought in the first 2 verses, and then he continues to go back in time and look at when it actually occurred. For Herod had laid hold on John, bound him, put him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife. And John said unto him, It is not lawful for thee to have her. And when he would have put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. And when Herod's birthday was kept, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Whereupon he promised with an oath to give her whatsoever she would ask. And she, being instructed of her mother, said, Give me here John the Baptist's head in a charger. And the king was sorry, nevertheless, for the oath's sake, and them which sat with him at meat, he commanded it to be given her. And he sent and beheaded John in the prison, and his head was brought in a charger and given to the damsel, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took up the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. That's where we want to pick it up. I want to pick it up with Jesus. I want to look at, here's John, and John has been killed, and they go and tell Jesus. Well, I want you to think about something with me for a moment. When something like this happens, I think it's not really uncommon, particularly if it's something dramatic such as this, that you really kind of have a natural inclination to kind of want a little time apart, a little time to reflect upon it, a little time to think about it, a little time to mourn before you begin to interact with other people. And Jesus was a human being. And therefore, he reacted much as we might also have acted. Now, there's some things to think about when you think about the relationship that Jesus had with John. And sometimes you don't remember them. In the book of Luke, chapter 1 and verse 17, we're told, number 1, that John was actually a relative of Jesus. John was not just the introducer of Jesus to the world, which he in fact was, but he was actually a relative of Jesus. What we find is that he was, in fact, according to verse 36, his mother, Mary, is said to be the cousin of Elizabeth, who was the mother of John. And so when you look at these 2 women, I'm not sure. Cousin is kind of an abstract term in English as well as in Hebrew. Someone can be your cousin, be first, second, third, whatever. And I don't know exactly how close the relationship was. I've never been able to actually discover that, but they were related. So John the Baptist wasn't just a co-worker of Jesus. He was actually a relative of Jesus. And the second thing, John was the person, according to verse 17 of this chapter, whose mission it was to introduce Jesus to the world and to make the preparation for His coming into the world. Said He shall go before Him in spirit and in power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers of the children, the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So John was the introducer of Jesus. He was also a relative of Jesus. And so when you read verse 13 in this particular passage in Matthew chapter 14, when Jesus heard of it, He heard when these men came and told Jesus that John had been killed. He departed thence by ship unto a desert place apart. Now, if you stop and think for a moment, you know, if someone passes away in their sleep, it's a terrible event, and it's a shocking event, and it really is a horrible event. But if someone had their head cut off, was beheaded, I'm pretty sure that the shock would be intensified. So here's Jesus, and these people come and tell Him that someone who is your relative, someone who is a very close associate with you in the work of as the Messiah, introducing you to the world, actually giving you the first of your apostles, if you read John 1, first several of them. Now, if you think of that, you can realize what a shock it would have been, and how natural it would have been for Jesus to want just a little time to Himself, to be able to kind of, as we sometimes say, sort things out in His mind. But it's interesting as to what happened. He goes by ship to a deserted place, a desert place, or a deserted place. He goes somewhere He knows where nobody's going to be. But, in verse 13 and 14, and when the people had heard thereof, they followed Him on foot out of the cities. Now, of course, if you look at the Sea of Galilee, you kind of understand what's taking place. Jesus goes by ship across the sea, and then the people just walk around the bank and go to the same location. And so he's going there to seek some solitude, and a great multitude's following. Now, how big was the multitude? I don't know exactly. I know that later we're going to find that there were 5,000 men besides the women and children. So that means you probably had somewhere between 8 and 12,000, 15,000. I don't know exactly how many people were there, but that was not going to be a place of solitude. These people came and came to Jesus, and Jesus went forth and saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion toward them, and He healed their sick. So here He goes. He takes a ship. He goes to a deserted place to have some time alone, and several thousand people show up, and all of a sudden His plans are suspended, and He finds Himself tending to the needs of these people who came to be with Him. Now, you need to think about that, because it's very characteristic of Jesus, and it's something we're going to read about as we kind of bring things to a close at the end of the lesson. One of the most important, or impressive, I guess I should say, miracles that Jesus ever performed took place at this time. Because these people come to be with Jesus. Now, you know, I've talked many times about when I was a young boy. I remember in 1958, Christmas of that year, Christmas vacation of that year, my family and I went up to Mount Pleasant to look at a house that my dad had found for us to buy. We were going to move there and live there. And we went up there, and on a Saturday, the best of my knowledge at that particular time, in Mount Pleasant, there were 3 restaurants to choose from, 3 places to eat. And I still remember, as far as I'm aware, that's the first time I ever ate in a restaurant, in a sit-down restaurant, to sit down and eat a hamburger in a restaurant. First time I can ever remember it happened. I was in 5th grade. But there weren't many. And I can remember that at about that same time, or right before, I went on a trip with my first cousins and my uncle and aunt. We went to Arkansas. Got about dinner time, and we like to never found a country store to buy a pound of bologna and a loaf of bread. I mean, it wasn't like now where every time you get off the interstate, you got 15 restaurants to choose from. Well, think about the days of Jesus, how it would have been. This was a desert place, a deserted place. There was nobody there. There was no community. There were no people there. And all these people following out there. And so when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, this is a desert place, and the time is now past. In other words, there's not time really for these people to go to the villages and buy something to eat. And so Jesus said unto them, they need not depart. Give ye them to eat. And they say unto him, we have here but 5 loaves and 2 fishes. And Jesus said, bring them hither to me. I'm reminded, and you may be as well, of when Jesus, the first miracle that he ever performed, turning the water to wine at a wedding feast. And I'm reminded of that event and his mother's faith when he said, fill up the bottles. And she looked and said, just do as he says. Do whatever he tells you to do. Whatever he instructs you, you do that. Have you ever been in a situation where someone says something that they're going to do and you're involved in it and you're sitting in your mind thinking this is not possible and we're going to be very embarrassed at the end of this event? I've wondered sometimes how these disciples must have felt. You look at the conversation and you kind of get an inkling of how they might have felt. They never suspected that he would say, okay, that's fine, just bring them hither. Here we have 5 loaves, 2 fishes, and several thousand people, and he just says, bring them hither. And he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass. And he took the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and brake and gave the loaves to his disciples, and the disciples to the multitude, and they did all eat. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I don't know about you, but had I been one of the disciples, one of the apostles on that day, that would have been quite an event. Can you imagine that you're starting to serve, and you're looking at it, and you've got a crowd of thousands of people, and you've got a table that would hold it all without any problem. In fact, half of it would probably have held it all. And here you are, that you're coming and picking up, and you're going and spreading to the crowd. And you know in your mind you're thinking, okay, we're going to feed the first 2 people on the front row. And everybody else is going to go away hungry. But it didn't happen. And so they took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. And after Jesus had given thanks for it, they began to distribute it. And they did all eat and were filled. And then, to really cap it off, they took up of the fragments that remained 12 baskets full. Now, I have a pretty good notion that everything they had originally was in one basket. I have a pretty good feeling that would be true. I mean, 5 loaves and 2 fishes wouldn't be too hard to put in one basket. And you feed several thousand people, and then you have 12 times as much as you had in the beginning. You think of impressive. And after they had eaten, and they that had eaten, it says, were about 5,000 men, beside women and children. Now, it's at this time that finally you say, okay, Jesus sails to the deserted place. He's trying to have some time alone. He's going to be able to mourn and sort his thoughts out, as we sometimes say. And these several thousand people intervene, and he ends up healing a bunch of them, feeding all of them. And so finally, after all that, the evening finally comes, and straightway Jesus constrained his disciples to get into a ship. So he's still seeking that time alone. He constrained his disciples to get into a ship to go before him to the other side while he sent the multitude away. Now I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to think about it. Now these disciples had just been through a situation where Jesus said, well, we've got 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Seat these thousands of people and feed them. And they kind of scratched their head and did it, I'm sure. And now, Jesus is at this location that he sailed to, and he said, you just go ahead and sail on over yonder by yourself, and then I'll take care of myself. And they probably kind of wondered about that as well. But at any rate, the interesting thing is that he's finally getting that time that he desired in the beginning. But when did he get it? When everyone else's needs were met. So when he had sent the multitudes away, what did he finally do? He went up into a mountain apart to pray. And when the evening was come, he was there alone. Now, if you go back up to verse 15, when he said, the people said it was evening, obviously evening is a generic term, and there it was beginning, perhaps the sun was setting, and now it is perhaps nighttime, and Jesus is there, and he finally gets time to go into the mountain apart to pray. Interestingly enough, he gets the time to pray, and then we see the event that we talked about a little bit this morning. We didn't read all of this, but we want to read it all this evening. In verse 24, all right, the apostles went. Now, if you were one of the apostles and Jesus had said, y'all get in the boat and sail on around. Now remember, the crowd had followed him around on foot, so this was a place that could be accessed either by water or by land. Obviously, water is generally an easier proposition, less lengthy. And I suspect that the apostles thought that, hey, you know, when Jesus gets ready to catch up with us, he'll walk around just like the multitudes had walked around, and we'll be able to get back together and go about our business. Of course, that wasn't what happened. Now, I don't know what Jesus had in mind when he first told them that you go ahead and sail and I'll catch up with you. But here's what he did. The ship was in the midst of the sea. So the apostles had left on something that should have been a relatively short voyage. And they're not getting anywhere. And they're tossed with the waves, for the wind was contrary. And the fourth watch of the night. Now, if I'm correct, the fourth watch, generally the watches would have been from about 6 to 9. That would be the first. About 9 to 12, that would be the second. About 12 to 3 would be the third. The fourth watch would probably have been somewhere between 3 and 6 o'clock in the morning. Now stop and think about this for a moment. You ever had a day like that? You ever had a day that was filled with all kinds of activities and extends itself so that it goes into the night and then you're almost to the next morning? Almost to the next morning. You kind of keep that in mind. We're almost to the next morning now. And here's Jesus, and he, at that point in time, he does catch up with the apostles in a way that they probably never imagined would happen. The disciples saw him walking on the sea. They were troubled. They said, it's a spirit. We talked about this morning. They cried out with fear. Straightway Jesus spake unto them, saying, be of good cheer, it is I, be not fearful, be not afraid. And Peter answered him and said, Lord, if it be thou, bid me come unto thee on the water. Seems to be kind of a test. Okay, if this is really you, then you bid me and let me come. And I believe you have the power to do that. And he said, come. And when Peter was come down out of the ship, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. And when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched forth his hand and caught him and said unto him, O thou of little faith, wherewith didst thou doubt? And then when they were coming to the ship, the wind ceased. I don't know exactly what time that would have been. This is getting on toward morning. This is the time that Jesus has already been involved in work for about 24 hours. And it's interesting that when you look then to verse 33, this is one of those days that kind of caused men to reflect upon the true nature of the man that was before them. These people, obviously, as they thought of Jesus, here's what they said in verse 33. Then they that were in the ship came and worshipped him, saying, of a truth, thou art the Son of God. Now, the reason I entitled this thing, A Day in the Life of Christ, A Day in the Life of Jesus, is because I really wanted you to be able to see what an impact this had on people. I mean, these people looked at Jesus and all the things that had transpired that day, and they, at the end of it, they understand that, hey, He is who He claims to be. He is, in fact, the Son of God. Now, in verse 34 through 36, when they were gone over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place had knowledge of Him, they sent out unto all the country around about, and brought unto Him all that were diseased, and besought Him that they might only touch the hem of His garment, and as many as touched were made perfectly whole. Now again, stop and consider this. Remember, kept kind of point out as we went along. Jesus was putting aside His own self, and He was putting their needs first. You went through an entire day of that, and what's interesting about this, He comes to the next morning. Have you ever actually done that? I remember one time going somewhere and came to Tennessee with a fellow named Bascom Parham to pick up some pews at Locust Street in Mount Pleasant, drove back to Valdosta. We drove up here, we loaded the pews, and we drove back. I remember it because there was a snowstorm on Monteagle as I was driving that U-Haul truck. Actually, it was a Ryder truck across it, and it was a really exciting experience. But it took a while, and it was a 2-day event. And I remember when I got home, how tired I was, and I stopped and I think about Jesus. Just think about the sacrifice that He made. I know we often think about Him dying on the cross, and I understand that's the ultimate. But His entire life reflected that idea. Here He is. All this has transpired. He's lost a cousin, a friend, an associate. He's trying to find time to mourn. He finally finds time for a short period of time during the night, somewhere about 4 or 5 hours alone. And then all of a sudden, he's back with the apostles, and he has to rescue them. And then he goes, and these people want him, and he's involved in all that. It really just kind of makes you to understand when you think of the life of Jesus, because here's something to think about. This was an eventful day in the life of Jesus. But I want you to think about two things. One is this: how long was the earthly ministry of Jesus? It's about 3 years. He was about 30 years old when He began. He was 33 when He was crucified. In John chapter 21, in verse 25, John made this statement: "And there are also many other things which Jesus did, the which, if they should be written, every one, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that should be written." So I kind of take it from that statement that this life in the day of Jesus was probably much like all the other days in the life of Jesus. That His life was one that was filled with activity, and the activities were always activities that were meeting the needs of the people that were around Him, sometimes spiritually and sometimes physically. Now, when you see Jesus setting aside His own needs and wishes, I want you to remember a couple of passages. I want to talk with you about them. In Matthew chapter 20, we mentioned this morning, didn't really talk about it a great deal, I believe, in Bible class. The mother of John and James and John came to Jesus, and they wanted Jesus, or she wanted Jesus to elevate them, and one of them would be given the second highest position of prestige in the kingdom, and the other the third, one on the right hand, one on the left in thy kingdom. And Jesus rebuked her and them. And in the process of that, in verse 25, he goes and he calls all of them together, and he says, "You know that the princes of the Gentiles," because notice what he said in verse 24. The 10 heard what was said, and so they were moved with indignation, which kind of suggests that maybe they would have liked to have those positions of honor. I don't know. But I do know what Jesus told them. He said, "You know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them. They that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you. But whosoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever be chief among you, let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. And I want you to stop and consider something. You remember that a few weeks ago, we had a lesson in which we talked about Esther. And we looked at the beginning of the book of Esther. It talked about a king Ahasuerus and his first wife Vashti. And it talked about the nature of their life and the service that was rendered to them. Now just stop and think for a moment. Do you suspect in the White House that whoever the occupant is at any particular time makes his own cup of coffee in the morning? I doubt it. Do you think he even makes a sandwich? I doubt that. You think he even gets up to turn the TV on if he wants it on? Well, you say he's got a remote. Probably somebody else does that for him. Everything is probably prepared. That's kind of the way it is. But Jesus said, in the kingdom of heaven, it's not that way. He said the greatest is the one who's your minister. And so if you look at his life, and that one day is just a small excerpt of a 3-year period of time. You have one day out of 1,000 approximately. And you're looking at that one day. And it makes you to understand what Jesus devoted his life to. In Philippians chapter 2, there's another passage in which the Apostle Paul was talking about Jesus, and he was talking about the example that he set for us. And he said kind of much the same thing, beginning in verse 3. He said, let nothing be done through strife or vainglory. What he really is discussing is saying when we make decisions in life, we can't make decisions based upon what we like, what we wish, and what we want to be so. That's really not the way decisions are made in life. I mean, a lot of people try to live their life like that, but it doesn't work very well. I mean, what we have to understand is, as sometimes you're reminded by your parents, you're not the only one that lives here. There's a lot of things that go on. And Paul said, Christians, we can't be acting in strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look, not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. And then he said, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. I'll tell you something. People sometimes learn pretty quickly that the world doesn't revolve around them. And until we learn that, until we learn, especially as a Christian, that our interest has to be in being of service. And we can't think in terms of just what matters to me. Somebody has said, it's not how many years you live, but what you do with those years that matter. And that's true. I heard a sermon many years ago, and I thought about it. If you think about people and the things you remember about them, if I mentioned Methuselah, what would be the thing that would come to your mind? He is the oldest recorded living human being. He lived longer than any man ever recorded. Now let's ask another question. What did he do? You don't know. And I don't either. Because God didn't reveal it. We don't know what he did. His life may have been a life filled with great things. His life might have been a total bust. We don't know because God doesn't mention it. The only thing that we know about him is he lived a long time. That's really all we know. We know he's the oldest recorded living human being. Oldest life that anyone ever lived. Well, what if he did nothing with it? What if he just kind of laid around and took it easy and did nothing? Of what value would it be? It's an interesting thought. I want to go back to Acts 9 for a moment and read something and then conclude the lesson. In Acts 9, there's a relatively obscure disciple mentioned. As far as I'm aware, and I may be wrong in this, but I believe it is the only mention made of her. She had two names. She was named Tabitha, which was by interpretation Dorcas. And both names are used in this particular text. Now, If you read what's said in verse 36 and 37, it's interesting what's said. She died. There was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. This woman was full of good deeds and alms deeds, which she did. And it came to pass in those days that she was sick and died. And when they had washed, they laid her in an upper chamber. Now they sent and they fetched Peter, and he came, and here's what's said in verse 39. When he was come, they brought him into the upper chamber, and all the widows stood by him weeping, and showing the coats and garments which Dorcas made while she was with them. Now, that's a great testimony to this woman. It's a great testimony. I mean, you think about all that she did. Now, the interesting thing about this, and it kind of goes back to the passage that, or the song rather, that we sing, if just a cup of cold water in His name given is the work that you can do. I mean, sometimes we need to realize that while we're looking for a big break to do some large thing, there may be a small task that can be done. And our life can be filled with small tasks and things that others may consider to be inconsequential, but the Lord takes note of them. And you stop and you think about that and you understand the real principle. When you look at a day in the life of Christ, the one thing you learn from it is, and if you look at every day, every recorded event, and John kind of compresses it down to just a few days in his life that he speaks of, what was he involved in? Is there any indication that Jesus ever just did whatever he pleased and said, I don't care about anybody else, I'm just going to do what I want to do? You ever see it? I don't. I think there's a great lesson to be learned from it, and we as Christians need to learn it. We need to learn that, yeah, it's important that we study and we teach and we learn. It's also important that we are the kind of person that Jesus was, and that was one that sought the best interest of others. So when you look at a day in the life of Christ, and you can pick any day you wanted to. We just picked one. But you could pick any other, and I think you would find much the same principle involved. Think about it. We talk about doctrinal matters sometimes. On Sunday evening, I try to pick out something that's a little bit different, and hopefully tonight, kind of that kind of lesson. And just kind of examine ourselves and think, what do you put first in your life? Yourself or others as you serve God? It's an important point. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. If you need to respond to the gospel invitation to be baptized into Christ or to perhaps correct something in your life that needs correcting, we can give you the opportunity to do that as together we stand as we sing.